Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Laura Williamson, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Demos. We're so glad you're here with us. We know that many of you are under extraordinary pressure right now. We are, I think, 47 days out from the election, an election in which the white power structure is working even harder than usual to keep folks from voting, particularly Black and brown folks. We're also still in the middle of a global pandemic, and many communities are fighting for their lives. So we are really grateful that you've made time here this afternoon to join Demos and this distinguished panel for a radically honest conversation about our democracy. This is the second in a series of conversations that Demos is hosting under the Radically Honest Conversations frame. The idea today on Constitution Day is to talk really honestly about the problems of democratic exclusion and our Constitution, and also to talk about what we can do about it and what the folks who you're going to hear from are already doing about it. Our first radically honest conversation was on inequality and the need to invest in Black communities, and we're going to be hosting more conversations over the coming months, so look out for those. We have an hour and a half together today. We'll spend a chunk of that time hearing from our panelists, who each have deep expertise in questions of democracy, and who I'll introduce in a moment. And then after that, we'll do a Q&A session, so you all can ask questions directly of the panel. A couple of housekeeping notes, because it's 2020 and everything is upside down. Two of our panelists had unavoidable conflicts come up at the last minute, and so they'll only be with us here for part of the time. So don't be confused if you see when you see Judith drop off around 4:30 and also Guy hop on sometime mid-conversation. Also, don't be alarmed if any uninvited guests make special appearances. Panelists, we welcome your tiny humans, your pets, any loved ones. We also are going to embrace technological challenges. We are all, many of us are juggling multiple jobs right now, and we're all doing the best we can. So we're just going to roll with it, and it's going to be beautiful. I'll also just remind us that we know that expertise doesn't just live on this panel. Many of you who are dropping your names into the chats from all over the country have yourself, been organizing and agitating and advocating to correct the problems in our democracy. So we are glad you're here. Please do keep, and if you're just joining now, please drop your name into the chat. Tell us kind of where you're coming from geographically, and if you have an organizational affiliation you want to name. And we're so glad you're here. I will say don't use the chat for questions because they might get lost. You can put questions in the formal Q&A process, which is if you click the little icon on the bottom that says Q&A, that's the place that we'll be tracking for questions. So we'll make sure they don't get lost. And then finally, the conversation is being recorded so that folks who aren't able to join today can follow along later, and we'll post that on our site. Special thanks to my colleagues Trisha Hahn and Ava Cates, who are the real masterminds behind the Zoom and the panel. So with all of that said, I think we can go ahead and jump in. As I mentioned, I'm Laura Williamson, and I'm on the democracy team at Demos. At Demos, we do a lot of thinking about the ways that our democracy doesn't live up to its promise, about the root causes of the gaps between what we would like to believe about our democracy and what we actually know is true about it, specifically the ways that our democracy excludes Black and brown communities on a systematic level. And we're doing a lot of thinking about what it would actually take and how we can actually build a democracy that is actually inclusive. I want to add that part of our thinking, a lot of our thinking, in fact, is informed by our relationships with state and local groups who are part of Demos's Inclusive Democracy Project. This is a cohort of predominantly Black and brown leaders who are engaged in state-based democracy and power building work across the country. And the reason that we're coming together today is that, in Demos's analysis, one of the problems, certainly not the only one, but one is that the Constitution itself does not do everything that it needs to do to guarantee democratic participation. In fact, since we're being radically honest, the Constitution is in some important ways a deeply white supremacist and exclusionary document. But there's a lot that we can do about that. And what I'm most excited to do is turn it over to our panel of powerful folks leading important work across the country who are pushing back on those exclusionary mechanisms and who are, again, working to build a more inclusive democracy. So I want to introduce folks and give you a chance to say more about yourself and your work. So let's start with you, Judith, if that sounds good. And thank you so much again for being here with us when you were on the road. We're so glad to have you.
Sure.
And so Judith, let me just say a word or two about you. Not that you need much introduction, but Judith Browne Dianis is the Executive Director of Advancement Project National Office. Many of y'all on the call probably know this, but just in case you don't, Advancement Project has been, for many years, the leading organization calling for an affirmative right to vote in our Constitution. Judith and your team's work over the last 20 years has informed many, I think, of our understandings about why our Constitution doesn't currently guarantee that right to vote. And it certainly influenced Demos's thinking about what it would take to do so. And we know that your work continues to this very day. Y'all are working on the latest right to vote amendment that was proposed in Congress just last month by Senators Warren and Durbin. And so I'd love to, as you talk about yourself and your work at the Advancement Project, I'd also love to invite you to tell us about, why a conversation, why calling for a right to vote amendment right now in this current political moment, when we are, again, living in the midst of a global pandemic and uprisings in the sense of Black lives, why this moment is the time to be calling for a guaranteed right to vote.
Sure. Well, thanks, Laura. And as everyone might see, my background is a little crazy. I am driving my daughter to college, so we made a pit stop so that we could do this. And so, because I wanted to be here with Demos, because I want to thank you all for, there was a point in time when we were working on the affirmative right to vote where we would call anybody who was calling for a right to vote the crazies. And so welcome to the crazies. We're excited to have more people on board. And the reason we were being called crazies is because so many people thought and still think that there is a right to vote that is implicit in the Constitution and that was sufficient. I think the moment that we're in is underscoring why that may not be accurate. That in fact, when we look at this particular election where we will be voting in a pandemic, we can see across the country this fight where people are having to choose between their health and their right to vote. It's as if the right to vote actually meant nothing. And that there are states that have made clear that they are going to make it harder, that they don't care that this is a pandemic, that they're doing business as usual, that they're not going to send those absentee ballots, that they don't want to count every vote, and that this is the moment where we see that this is a continuation of over 200 years of fighting for who gets to have a say in our democracy. And it's also important because in this moment, because not only do we have this pandemic and we're seeing it play out, one of the things we've always said about the right to vote is one of the problems is that we don't have national standards. So we have 13,000 election jurisdictions that carry out elections 13,000 different ways. And we're seeing that in the pandemic. But then let's add to it that right now, with the movement for Black lives, what we are seeing is a fight and a continuation of a movement for Black people to be included in this Constitution. And that has been very clear with regard to voting, that when we started this journey on our so-called democracy, that Black people were not included, and that it was intentional, and that only white men with power were allowed to have a right to vote in this country. And so now we have the coming of and the rebirth and the reinvigoration of a movement calling for Black power, calling for the rights, full rights of citizenship. And so it is in this moment that the right to vote is incredibly important, because we're getting a civics lesson as people are in the streets protesting to defund the police, to abolish ICE. We're getting a civics lesson in who actually has power in this country. And so the right to vote is a critical tool. It is not the only way in which we get political power, but it is a critical tool. And we all know that the reason that so many people do not want us to have a constitutional right to vote is because this country would change and white supremacy would be over. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Judith. I love that civic lesson and who actually has power. I know you have to hop off soon, so I will circle back to you before long. But before some follow-ups, I wanted to invite Ivana and Andrea into the conversation. So Ivana, I'm going to introduce you next, if that works. Ivana is the Deputy Director of Blueprint North Carolina, a network of dozens of organizations working for a more just and equitable North Carolina. Ivana is also a leader within Demos's Inclusive Democracy Project, which I described earlier, and Ivana in particular has been instrumental in broadening my understanding of what constitutes a democracy issue, and more importantly, the kind of intersectional organizing and multi-issue movement building that we have to engage in if we're going to actually affect democratic inclusion. So Ivana, why don't you tell us more, tell us about yourself, about Blueprint North Carolina, and if you can speak to how you all think about the relationship between the right to vote and your much bigger, broader work of building democracy in North Carolina.
Yeah. Hey y'all, I am, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be a part of this conversation where the starting point is like, what is the work that we're gonna do together? So thank you so much for having me. I guess I wanna start by telling you all this, like a learning moment for me in organizing in North Carolina. We were probably in 2018, Blueprint convened, Blueprint was a part of convening a group of folks to, as a part of our North Carolina statewide police accountability network, which lives under the Black Leadership and Organizing Collective. And by then, like, Blueprint had sort of had this moment where we were like, we're not just a civic engagement capacity building entity, right? We're trying to lean into what it means to support movement, right? And to us, that meant that we needed to integrate the civic engagement capacity building work into year-round organizing, right? And that's why we were bringing the strength of our civic engagement capacity to this space of folks who were the front line of holding down police accountability and divestment from police organizing in North Carolina. And we were in that space, and we thought that a critical piece of that training needed to be like how you just don't get targeted by the IRS and folks who are trying to infiltrate and take you down just for violating like this small piece of like a technicality in the C3 code, right? So we were doing all of this training and teaching folks how to build like GOTV plans, and we were super psyched. We were like, we're doing the work, y'all. And folks who were in the room flagged for us that that we were totally leaving out a group of people who couldn't engage, like who for them civic engagement did not mean casting a ballot, right? And that was like the narrow way that we were defining engagement in that moment. So that to me was just like this big aha, right? That oftentimes, like, especially like in these moments when we're getting like real close to like these big moments, we like these elections are obviously going to like be a huge turn the tide moment, and we like leave out all the other tools in the toolkit, and they leave out the folks who have so many other ways to engage in this system, including folks who are undocumented, who are disenfranchised because of the carceral state for a variety of reasons, et cetera. And so a lot of the work that Blueprint has been doing, and when we think about inclusive democracy, is exactly what Judith said, is making sure that we are not falling into that trap as an infrastructure of defining civic engagement narrowly, and defining inclusive democracy just within the terms of the right to vote, because civic engagement is so much more, right? 2020 has been the year to prove that, right? We had this amazing opportunity to mobilize people around the census. We had an opportunity to then like build the bridge then straight into voter registration, GOTV for voting, and now eventually redistricting, which everybody can get involved in. And hopefully layering all of that is the year-round issue-based organizing around the things that are impacting folks year-round. And so that's, that to me is the power of having a conversation about an affirmative right to vote, that it's a piece of this much larger conversation, an affirmative right to participate, an affirmative right to belong, and to have a way to like manifest the collective will of the community that you belong to, right? And so for us, it's about being a part of organizations that are building power, that can learn the civics of what are the many different levers that we can intervene to make those things possible. So that's the way that Blueprint is thinking about voting and all the different interventions that we can make within our democratic infrastructure. And beyond that, we need to be really explicit about what we're doing that for, right? Democracy, like any other infrastructure, can be manipulated for or against breaking down oppression, right? I can't help but think about unions in this context, like police unions, for example, right? Like traditionally we think of unions as progressive, and then we have this example of police unions that are being wielded against Black people in this moment, right? Or have been historically. So if we don't think about building up democratic institutions without an explicit anti-racist lens, without an explicit pro-working people lens, then that tool can be used against people without power. So while we are thinking about like the structural barriers of democracy, we have to continue to do the very hard, forever work of heart and mind work that is going to ensure that after we pass the amazing amendment, right, we're going to get to a place where we have the people that are going to be able to wield that tool in our favor.
Awesome, thank you, Ivana, and hello, Guy. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I want to transition next to Andrea, because we've been talking about sort of the idea of inclusive democracy and all the ways that our democracy is not currently, and sort of Andrea reflected back to me some of the similar themes that you just talked about, Ivana, around particularly power building. And processes that manifest the collective will of community. And so let me go to Andrea next. Andrea James is the founder and executive director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. When I first met Andrea, she was being propelled onto a stage to thunderous applause. So that the council's national convening, Free Her conference, and literally thousands of women were giving Andrea a standing ovation. And so I'm just sharing that so y'all know that you're about to hear from a real mover and shaker. So Andrea, tell us about yourself and about this powerful network that y'all have built with the National Council. And I'd love to hear your reflections too on sort of how your members are building power amongst incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls, some of whom, perhaps many of whom, cannot actually vote, and what specific strategies that y'all are employing to bring people not into a political process that was not designed to work for them and has never actually delivered, but instead to create an entirely different type of political process that sort of meets people where they are and allows people to actually win victories that lead to material improvements in their lives and their communities.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Laura, for that very kind introduction. I assure you that the work that we do is a people-led process, and it is led and determined by incarcerated sisters on the inside, whose lead we follow, and formerly incarcerated women and girls on the outside who drive this work. So it certainly is not me driving this. And I also want to say thank you to Judith, who forever we have relied upon the Advancement Project as kind of a North Star to help us to figure out some of the issues that we don't necessarily know how to articulate, and to it helps us to figure out how we're going to navigate through this course. We started our organization, our work, our organizing, while we were incarcerated women inside of a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, and that was back in 2010. And the work has grown significantly since. We sat in the prison yard around a picnic table, and we literally, in 2010, it was a pretty unique year, because it was the year that Michelle Alexander's book had come out. Piper Kerman had also written a book, and also the ALEC had been exposed, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And that was really fascinating and interesting to us. It drove us, I taught English in the prison, and we used the classroom in the back of the prison to start to organize, because we read Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag, and that really lit a fire underneath us to say, hey, at the end of that book, she chronicles the work that was being done by Black and brown women in and around Los Angeles in fighting on behalf of their incarcerated loved ones. And so all of these things, this alchemy of all of these things had an effect on us as almost 2,000 women at the time up at the camp and down at the FCI, who were crammed into this prison. And I always think of it, as I looked up over my prison bunk, as a slave ship. Not in comparison to the just barbaric conditions of that, but close to it often in many ways, but certainly the way that we were head to toe packed into this women's federal prison, predominantly Black women. And we started to organize ourselves as a result of that, because mostly we didn't hear anything about what we were going through. We were Black and brown women from cash poor communities, from communities that were most directly affected by incarceration. The complexities of our lives were great. We were mothers, most of us, more than 85% of us, just under 90% of us in the prison at the time, and in any prison or jail at that time in the country, and still today, were mothers. Women were serving draconian drug sentences for the most part, a minimum 10-year and up 15, 20, 25-year sentences. In all of the discussion and the uptick back in 2010 about the need to end incarceration of women in general, or end mass incarceration as it was referred to, we still heard nothing about all of the difficulties and struggle that women were going through trying to parent from a payphone in a prison. And the fact that we had been, many of us, the last defense between the system and the street and our children. And our children were left to struggle through life without their mothers. And we decided in that prison on that day in the summer that we were going to organize ourselves. Another issue was the Adoption Safe Family Act, which has been one of the most destructive, not as spoken about as the '94 crime bill, but one of the most destructive pieces of legislation for Black and brown women in this country. That's the act that allows for the termination of parental rights, and it's horrible anyway, but particularly for incarcerated women, because there's no period of tolling of that time due to incarceration. And so it has led to the destruction of so many Black families, separation of Black mothers from their children. And so we decided we were going to do something to change that. We had no idea how we were going to go about doing that, but we knew we were going to do it. I was tasked with carrying that work outside with me by the women who were also the founders of the National Council, because I was the only one that was there serving a 24-month sentence. I was a lawyer, a trial lawyer who was sentenced to serve 2 years for wire fraud, and everybody else in that prison was serving 10 years or more. And they weren't coming home anytime soon. And the matriarch of our organization was Grandma Phyllis Hardy, who was on her 22nd year at the time of incarceration. And that was the norm for most of the women in the prison and in prisons across the country at the time. And so I carried that work out with me. And then it took us a while to figure out how to operationalize a goal that we set for ourselves of ending incarceration of women and girls. And we finally did. Took us a long time to do it. Took us a lot of listening, over about 3 years of listening tours throughout the country. And also listening to Black and brown women who are heads of households in the most directly affected communities about what their issues are, because women have been directly affected by incarceration long before we became the fastest incarcerated population. And so we dumped all this stuff on the table about 2 years ago and came out with these organization building blocks that have helped us kind of through the back door to create civic engagement in communities where there was no civic engagement happening, where people were referred to as living in zero propensity communities, where people were so marginalized, so disenfranchised, in communities where through our participatory budgeting projects, for instance, we've determined that in some of the most incarcerated corridors in the United States, there has been regular and consistent investment, $20, $30 million investments a year in the police departments, in the jails, and in the state prisons, and zero to a level of austerity and investment in the Black communities that were most entangled, are most entangled in the criminal legal system. And so we started there to figure out how are we going to get people to become more civically engaged. And the building blocks that we pulled together were all as a result of this listening tour, and they start with participatory defense, the bedrock of our organizing, because it's a tangible tool that gives people who have loved ones who are being churned in a criminal legal system, people who are fighting to try and release people who have been in prison for decades. It works on the front, the middle, and the end. And it's the best capacity building tool that we have learned about ever. And those people go on in our organizing spaces to do participatory budgeting work. And when people begin to see up close and personal the level of austerity of investment in their lives and the increase in millions and millions and millions of dollars in the police and in prisons, they realize that I'm out of prison now. So you must be talking about coming after my kids and my grandkids. And that's not something that we're willing to tolerate any longer. And so as a result, we have these cornerstones of organizing, participatory defense, participatory budgeting, and transform harm that's helping us build alternate systems to the current systems that exist of police, jails, prisons. And these systems are about building power, economic power, political power, through these organizing tools that are being played out in hyper local communities, the blocks in the city that are the most incarcerated corridors in that area.
Thank you, Andrea. I feel like you got right to the heart of it. The only way that we've actually made improvements in the problems of democratic exclusion in our country, like since it has begun, is through direct organizing by people who've been excluded. And so you talked about, obviously, people behind bars and their families and communities back home. That's been true by Black folks since, again, the beginning of our country. Our democracy is only what it is, outstanding problems notwithstanding, because of that organizing. And it makes me think about something that I learned from y'all, Judith, when I was just starting to think about a right to vote amendment and looking at y'all's resources and y'all's work on this, of an amendment as actually like as much as, you know, an exercise in finding the right, like constitutional language and sort of a policy exercise. It's actually a tremendous organizing exercise, and that it's an opportunity to do the kind of movement building, infrastructure building, and organizing that I think both Ivana and Andrea have talked about. So just in the remaining time that we have you, I'd be curious if you have any reflections on that. You know, and sort of the value of that kind of organizing, the value of an amendment, a right to vote amendment as sort of an organizing mechanism or tool, especially while holding just the tremendous work that it is to actually get an amendment passed, right? It has to be introduced by 2/3 of each house and ratified by 3/4 of the states. And so it's a tremendous and formidable task. And yet, if you can just talk more about the value of that as an organizing strategy.
Sure. So for us, we started down this road after the 2000 election. And when people were like, wait a second, what is going on? And how did they walk off with an election? And why, and the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore, which made clear that there was no right to vote. And people wanted something to say, we're going to fix this, right? That there are these cracks in our democracy. And most of us know that the cracks have been there since the beginning of time. They were made into the fabric of what this country was and how people in this country were going to be treated with regard to their political power. And so for us, we kept thinking, okay, well, we actually do need to change, we need a right to vote because we need a legal structure and a foundation for actually making sure that people can actually vote. But before then, that the idea is that if we could use the right to vote as a narrative, as something that people would know, we aspire to this, because we also knew that the political winds, WINDS, were not there to actually get a win right away, but that we needed to have something that we could aspire to and that we could organize around. And so we started playing with, okay, well, let's try and introduce it into legislation in a few places. So we did some polling, and we had a bill dropped in the state of Florida, which we knew again wasn't going to pass, but it was number one, it let people know that there's a problem and we need to fix it, right? You went and voted and they stole the election, or we now have this pandemic and we actually should have something different because all these governors who decide that masks are not required should not be then impacting your right to vote. And so having the ability to say to folks on the ground that, number one, we're going to fix this. Number two, that it's a little bit, again, getting back to the civics lesson, right, of what is in the Constitution, what isn't in the Constitution, the history behind that, why that compromise was made in the first place to the disadvantage Black people in this country, and to disadvantage poor people in this country, to disadvantage indigenous people in this country, and to be able to educate people about the reason that it doesn't exist in the first place, and to get them fired up about voting and participating, right? And having this idea that this is a right. And there's always been this back and forth between, is it a right or is it a privilege? And we really wanted to make clear to people that this is your right. Take your right, exercise your right. And so the more that we could get people, and I think this is still true, the more that we can get people to imagine a country where democracy is theirs, that they own it, that it is not owned by the people who are sitting in Congress and state legislatures, but that it is theirs because it is their right, then we will have a different level of participation, hopefully, that people will say, claim it, right? Own it, claim it, and use it. And so I think that's where we see the openings for really good organizing campaigns around this, and with regard to the issues around rights restoration, right? Like what happened in Florida on Amendment 4 and the work of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which I'm proud to be, we are founding member of, and love Desmond and all the work that was done in Florida, but being able to say we need a right to vote because there's a segment of our community who got caught in this web of mass incarceration, for which Black people are the mass in mass incarceration. And we know it's unfair and unjust, and that we have to do something about it, and that they should never lose their right to participate in our democracy. And that this right to vote is this umbrella that allows us all to have a say and to be represented. And so I think it is a good organizing tool. I hope people will use it. I hope people will participate and weigh in Congress, because we need to let them know too that we're watching, and that we actually want them to make good on what we consider to be a right of every citizen in this country.
Thank you, Judith, and thanks so much for being here. We are really, really grateful for y'all's critical perspective and hard work. And safe travels. Awesome. Guy, we'd love to bring you in now. It's so good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Great to see you as well. Having me.
Awesome. So we've just been doing some introductions. I can say a few words for folks for context about who you are, and then have a question for you about, voting rights, democracy, and the Constitution. We've all been reflecting on that in our introductions. So Dr. Uriel-Charles is a constitutional scholar and the Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law at Duke University Law School. And you came on, you caught pieces of this probably from everybody, but in sort of musing on the questions of democracy in our Constitution, everybody's kind of talked about this idea of who's in and who's not, who belongs, kind of who our Constitution is actually for and about, and who it's not, who gets a say in our democracy. I know as a constitutional scholar, you've put a lot of thought into these questions, and specifically how the institutions in the United States, both the Constitution and others, have actually restricted the concept of citizenship and belonging, that our institutions actually define we the people quite narrowly. So if you can tell us, as you introduce yourself, kind of what you see as the key deficiencies in how our Constitution addresses this question, and also kind of what we should be aspiring to as we try to fix these deficiencies.
Thank you so much. And thank you to my co-panelists, because these are all amazing people and doing great work. And so in some respects, my work is dedicated to them and builds upon the work that they are doing. As Laura mentioned, I teach and I write about the American Constitution. I also write about race and law and racial inequality. And in the context of voting, in many respects, both of those things come together. And where it begins, and I want to just provide a few characteristics, what I consider to be some key characteristics of the American constitutional and electoral system. And the first is that there's no positive federal right to vote within our Constitution. So if you take the South African Constitution as an example, it provides that every adult has the right to vote in elections for any legislative body. And then it also provides electors, so every adult has a right to vote, and then it also provides some other specifications. Whereas the American Constitution does not have anything like the South African Constitution. It says, look, if you are an adult citizen, if you are a citizen of the United States, you have the right to vote in every legislative body, federal as well as states. So we have a constitutional structure that does not provide in any way specifically. The most that our Constitution provides is it says in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, electors of each state shall have the qualifications of electors of the most numerous branch. So what it basically does is it leaves it up to the states to define who the electors are going to be. And so that's why the other aspect of it, so the first aspect, key characteristic, is that there's no federal right to vote. The Constitution has some negative prohibitions, so you can't deny the vote where it's provided on the basis of race, 15th Amendment, on the basis of sex, 19th Amendment, poll tax, age, but it doesn't provide for an affirmative right. The other aspect of it is it's very much decentralized. Federal practice is very much decentralized. And so we depend a lot on each state. That's why voting really differs from state to state. So one state can have same-day registration and can make it easier for people to vote. And another state can have very different rules that make it harder for people to vote. So another key characteristics is decentralization, and that's embedded within the Constitution itself. That's not, that's just a matter of practice. Federalism is just a key component of both election law and election practice, where Article 1, for example, Section 4 of the Constitution says that the times, places, and manners of holding elections, even for federal elects, specifically for federal senators and representatives, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislator thereof, even though Congress may have supervisory authority over those regulations. You might think that's odd. Why is it that the states get to decide who, the times and manners of representation for federal elections? But that's how our Constitution provides it. And what it also means is that even at the local level, you have decentralization. So one county might do one thing and another county might do something very different, right? So if you want to understand why we have so many different types of practices and how there's so many possibilities for different barriers, you have to think about the constitutional structure. And I'll just make one last point, which is that voters bear the burden of political participation. So in some democracies, the government takes responsibility for registering voters and for making sure that voters are able to participate, whereas in our democracy, for the most part, the burden depends upon voters and depends upon activists, right? So that means that when the government erects a barrier, whether it's where it puts a polling place or registration, you as the voter, you have to find out, you have to get the information, and you have to bear the cost of political participation and of voting, which makes it obviously harder, and particularly harder if you are a person from a marginalized community, whether that's race or whether that's a combination of race and socioeconomic status or where you live, right? So there's so many burdens and barriers, and it's a function of our constitutional structure and our constitutional design. So part of what I do is try to write about this and inform people about it. And then of course, then work with organizations and to think about what are the remedies to the structure. And obviously an important remedy is a constitutional amendment. I will stop here.
Thank you, Guy.
I'm happy for another 50 minutes because usually it's like an hour class.
Thank you for that. I mean, I feel like I just took one of your classes and learned a great deal. So thank you for that introduction. And I mean, your points about the way that the Constitution essentially, and the decentralization and the onus and burden that it puts on the voter rather than the state to actually engage in civic participation, makes me think about just like how that actually plays out. Like, what does that actually mean in terms of people's like lived experiences with respect to voting? And that makes me think about North Carolina, where I am from, where Ivana and actually Guy are also call home, and is a place that has been the cutting edge of voter suppression in recent years. And so I'm curious. I want to go back to you, Ivana. And specifically want to talk about what voter suppression looks like in North Carolina this year. We know that historically, we know that at all times, voter suppression is a violent act. It keeps people from exercising democratic rights. But what it actually looks like in practice in recent years has been a little more sort of insidious and behind the scenes. So laws and policies that make it harder to vote, as you alluded to. And this year, we know that voters and even, voters and all kinds of community members are facing threats and then actual real violence at the polls and even already. And I know that y'all are confronting this in North Carolina. So talk to us a little bit about, again, tell us more detail about what that looks like in North Carolina, and talk to us about how communities are organizing both to ensure people can vote, but also simultaneously to keep our people safe as they try to.
Yeah. I appreciate this question because the threats are really real, right? It's like we have to deal with like the policy side of things, right? So, you know, there was a couple at the very beginning of all of this, we were dealing with like how many witness signatures need to be on the absentee ballots, that sort of thing. And then the other thing is just like just the spirit and the tone of that is surrounding this election, and the fact that that voters, especially like Black and Brown voters, we're just not operating in an environment that is welcoming, that says like you belong here, and that is really, really stark in this moment. And it's all like in this this long context, right, that has led up to 2020, right, where North Carolina has had like extreme partisan gerrymandering, like a long history of voter purges and challenges to the voter rolls based on like Spanish sounding last names, and targeting and threats to activists and organizers. That's our folks, right? So people in like who are organizing in rural communities who have like received death threats, who then like we have had to really support in getting out private security because they just really were worried for their lives. Restriction of a number of early voting days, and elimination of early voting sites in like historically Black polling locations. So this year, it's like all that, and then like a whole other layer because folks are emboldened by like national, like federal leadership, right? That's on TV every day. I think some things that maybe aren't making the news is that you've got sheriffs who are the same sheriffs who unsurprisingly are the same ones that are talking about ICE collaboration agreements, who already have ICE collaboration agreements, are making commitments to put their sheriffs at polling locations. So of course that's a thing, right? Which is why we cannot separate defunding the police and police accountability organizing from our work to create an inclusive democracy. It's one and the same. So that's a thing. There are intentional and unintentional disinformation campaigns, right, that are creating a lack of safety. One example of some of the disinformation that maybe could be unintentional. There was a story, I think, just yesterday about ballots that are being rejected. And so that's just like not great reporting. The ballots aren't rejected. It means that they weren't like completely filled out, and now it's early enough that the boards of elections got to do the work of making sure that they are properly processed, going back to the voter. But now there's all these stories out there that are like, your ballots are being rejected. And there's actually an opportunity to correct them. And it's just sort of like feeding into this broader narrative that our democracy is broken, which it is, but there's actually like mechanisms in place to make it right. And then on one great piece of news that we got recently, just to drop that in, is that our folks at Forward Justice, which some of you might be familiar with, won an amazing case on the penal disenfranchisement front, which basically proved or showed that once you have completed probation or parole, you cannot be restricted from voting just for the inability to pay fees. So we're really excited about that. They're basically saying that that's a poll tax. So that's some light on that front. But we're seriously just expecting like white supremacists at the polls, right? Because folks have been experiencing like that kind of violence in other locations. So in North Carolina, what we're doing is building on a decade of voter protection and party at the polls experience from organizations like Democracy NC, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, the Southern Vision Alliance, Common Cause, et cetera, to combine this commitment to voter safety, and bring a spirit of like joy and resiliency to the polls, right? Like what I heard from Andrea's comments is that we can't just like select from the options that they're giving us. And to me, thinking about voter safety is working within what they're giving us. And so what we're wanting to do is like say, civic engagement is actually something that's joyful and brilliant, and we're going to bring like all that energy to it, rather than like we're just going to react to what you're bringing to us, right? So like actually talking about like every community is doing something different in a COVID safe way, of course. So like a couple of years ago, like people like literally had pig pickings at polling locations, and there's like DJs and music, and it just looks different wherever you go. And we're gonna like build up this capacity for folks to de-escalate, to identify bad actors, and definitely to not call the police, because we keep us safe.
Thanks, Ivana, and I'm hearing a lot of intersections between the work that y'all are doing there and the work that you described, Andrea, around participatory defense, and making the connections between mass overinvestment in police budgets and underinvestment in communities. So I want to actually go back to you. You know, Ivana also talked about the right to vote for folks after they're off probation and parole, and we actually have a question from the audience, which is, would having a right to vote eliminate all restrictions on people in jail and prisons being able to vote? And, you know, I think this is in many ways, you know, one of the civil rights battles of our lifetimes. And the reason that it has to be, you know, reason that people who are behind bars or who are even back in their communities, but have fines and fees to pay, the reason that that has to be even a struggle is that it goes back to our Constitution again, as a theme from this conversation. There's a carve out in the 14th Amendment, which is meant to protect the right to vote. And the carve out says that everybody has the right to vote unless you've been involved in a crime or you've been criminalized, which of course our system does. So, you know, I feel like we've made progress on this in recent years, and efforts like the victory in Florida that Judith mentioned have been led by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, but we've also had seen a lot of backlash and a lot of retaliation. And I'm thinking actually about your home state of Massachusetts, and how actually until 2000, people in prisons had the right to vote and did vote. And it was actually in response to political organizing by people in Norfolk State Prison that lawmakers actually amended the Constitution to take away that right, because they were so threatened by people engaging in their democratic rights and organizing and building power. So talk to us a little bit about the National Council's approach to thinking about voting rights and power building and liberation, and if it's helpful to share more about that example from Massachusetts, or just sort of reflect more generally on this question from our audience member, and sort of the idea that this is one of the civil rights battles of our lifetime.
We did, up until 2000 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, incarcerated people still had the right to vote. And so our question as we're moving forward, and our challenge to folks, is to not just, as we think about what different looks like, to not just center this conversation on voting rights post-incarceration. It was the pushback from the state legislature, who mostly a pushback from white conservative men in the state legislature, that moved to amend the Constitution in Massachusetts, because currently incarcerated men out of Norfolk Prison decided that they were going to organize inside the prison, and to also organize their loved ones and family members and communities outside, to push back against mandatory minimum sentencing in Massachusetts. And as a result of that, and we had one senator, the first Black woman senator, Diane Wilkerson in Massachusetts, who stood up by herself, voted against that amendment to the Constitution, and said, when asked why she did that, why she stood on that side, she said the Constitution should never be used to take rights away from people. It should only be used to bestow rights upon people. And so when we think about, for instance, when we were in prison as mothers, there were lots of reasons why we still have been allowed to vote. We had families on the outside. We had children on the outside. They were going to school. There were lots of issues that involved our communities and our families on the outside that we should have been allowed to still weigh in on. The fact that we were convicted of what the state had determined was a crime, which we could argue how crime is also defined in this country and who it's defined to affect. But the complexities, when you look at the level of complexities, and I think the professor alluded to this when he talked about the burdens and barriers of people who are most affected by these voter suppression laws. When you look at the level of complexity in the lives of people who are incarcerated, who are formerly incarcerated, you realize very quickly that much of the lack of civic engagement, even if, such as in a state like mine in Massachusetts, where once you are out of a prison, you're automatically reinstated with the right to vote. Even in that scenario, the burdens and barriers and complexities in the lives of folks are so great. The oppression is so great. The disruption that the criminal legal system has caused for decades in the life of Black and brown people, predominantly in communities that are most entangled in this system, it automatically creates this almost insurmountable barrier to getting to a place in your personal life where you have time and space and capacity to think about voting. And now add COVID-19 onto it. I mean, formerly incarcerated people are already, prior to COVID-19, last hired, and we were the first fired when COVID took place. And we also know that, sorry, that's my son, and my dog. We also know that, we are not going to be the first to return and to be offered employment as we climb out of this deep economic depression as a result of COVID-19. But even, people are incarcerated and their children are dying. Imagine being incarcerated and getting word that a child of yours has been a victim of violence and died. People outside are struggling. They have a child or a loved one who's incarcerated for causing harm to another person, such as killing another person, and they have another child in the household who has lost their lives to these things. So how do all of these deep, deep disruptions and difficulties and complexities in folks' lives afford them the opportunity to re-engage civically in their communities? And so we knew that we really had to kind of take a backdoor approach to figuring this out about how to get people involved. And shout out to Silicon Valley Debug. We're partners with them in the National Participatory Defense Network. One of the most phenomenal, brilliant pieces of work, I think, in community organizing ever in the history of community organizing, Raj Jayadev and his team out there. But in addition to participatory defense, we've also learned from the People's Assembly in Mississippi, Rukia Lumumba, Chokwe Lumumba, Mayor Chokwe Lumumba's family and the legacy of their father who taught a People's Assembly process. And so this is what we're doing with these foundational building blocks of participatory defense. When people engage also in participatory budgeting, they see up close and personal how austere the investment has been in their community and in their loved ones' lives. And so they get involved and they want to create these alternate systems. But for us, it doesn't start post-incarceration. It starts because our community doesn't start beyond at the prison door. Our community, with all of our members and the loved ones that we have at the National Council, starts in the prison. Wherever our people are is how we define community. And so it has to be inclusive of all of those people as well. So we encourage folks to let's expand that that push. Let's expand how we're talking about this issue so that we're demanding the rights. Every human being who's incarcerated can probably give you 10 reasons why they should have the right to vote. Most of them, it will be directed toward their loved ones who are on the outside living out here. But also to have their voices heard around why they don't need to serve a 20-year sentence for drugs, and a number of other things, and why the current carceral system, why we are abolitionists, why the current carceral system only causes further harm, has not in decades of all the investment in police and prisons resulted in safer, more prosperous, more economically viable communities where the people are most directly affected by incarceration. And so pushing that larger picture to think about how do we get people engaged? What are the tangible organizing building blocks that we can use to do that, including movement lawyering. We have a phenomenal, our senior legal counsel, Catherine Chevchenko, is working deep, rolling up her sleeves deep in the mud, working. Demos has partnered with us and helped us to think through a number of ways that lawyers and movement lawyering can help us in our hyper local work. And so bringing all these pieces together, but really challenging all of us to open it up. Open it up. We're human beings, whether we're on a prison bunk or whether we're on our front stoop. We all have myriad reasons why we need the right to vote, why we should have the right to vote in a democracy.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm hearing the clear answer to that question is, if our goal is a multiracial inclusive democracy, yes, a right to vote amendment has to eliminate any restrictions on voting rights for anybody, whether they're incarcerated or not. And I'm hearing that alone is not enough, and that we have to put a lot of work into, again, building out a political process that actually that works for people for whom our current political process was not designed and has never worked. I want to just really briefly say a couple of words about Demos's proposal to amend the Constitution, because one of the key things that we focus on there is precisely this. It's ending the white supremacist practice of taking away people's right to vote because they've been criminalized by a racist criminal legal system. And, you know, Guy talked about how the right to vote in the Constitution is dealt with sort of as a negative right. You know, there's the protections against the denial of the right to vote. So our proposal would state the right to vote in the affirmative, make it what's called a positive right, as it is in the South African Constitution. And then we, you know, because we actually think that just stating the right to vote is not going to be, and the affirmative is not going to be enough in the current political context, and in the face of a Supreme Court that has made itself very clear that it is hostile to voting rights. We also include provisions to undo many of the other themes of democratic exclusion that have kept people, particularly Black and brown people, from voting. So I want to lift that up. I don't know if Trisha or anybody can, or maybe Brenda can drop it in the chat for anybody who's interested in taking a look after this. But it brings me to one of my final questions, and we're getting some great questions in from the chat, so I'll turn to those soon. But in drafting this amendment, we really were sort of stuck between thinking about the importance of like being really big and bold and saying exactly what we need to redraft our Constitution to actually be pro-democracy, and the reality that, you know, as our sort of most fundamental and enduring document, constitutional amendment language kind of has to withstand the test of time. And so I'm curious, as a constitutional scholar, Guy, or if either of you have reflections, Ivana or Andrea, Andrea, sort of on how we can kind of think about constitutional language that both, again, captures what we need and doesn't hold anything back, but that also kind of bridges the gap between a document that is otherwise not always or particularly explicit in its pro-democracy sort of language and frame.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two aspects that we have to consider. and I'll mention the second, but come to it in a moment. The second is that constitutional language is not the only thing that matters. So this goes to some of the points that Andrea raised, but let me do the first part first. So when you look at our Constitution, for the most part, the Constitution generally contains broad frames. So the Constitution may talk about equal protection or due process. And consistent with those broad frames, especially when you're thinking about voting, the temptation and the direction would be to try to be as parsimonious and as clear and clean as possible, and our Constitution is not like a code for the most part. There are some minor exceptions, like the 12th Amendment, for example, is an exception there. But for the most part, it just contains what some have referred to as majestic generalities, very broad language addressing particular questions and doing so in a succinct manner. And so one direction, you know, the South African Constitution is a very, very good example. And it would say something like every citizen has a right to vote, and that includes the full right of participation without any burdens imposed or unreasonable burdens imposed upon the citizen. All right. So we could come up with language that fits both within our constitutional tradition, and that addresses our worries that we have today. But we also have to think about the fact that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years from now, other people, and it will not be us, will be interpreting that Constitution. So part of what matters is not just the Constitution and its language, but also the politics and the culture. Let me give you two specific examples here. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law. But as all lawyers know, the court has interpreted the First Amendment to apply not just to Congress, but also to the states, even though the language of the Constitution is very specific, right? So language can be interpreted to broaden as well as to narrow. And what matters is not just the language, but the politics and the constitutional tradition and the activism and embedding the idea that the Constitution represents within the broader body politic. So we've interpreted the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to apply not just to inequality against, say, African Americans, its original beneficiaries, but to everybody, regardless of race, as well as to race, gender, and eventually all other salient identities, right? So constitutional interpretation can broaden, and the broadening of the language, so even though you're operating within a particular language in the Constitution, but we interpret it in a manner that can broaden or can narrow, but that's a function of our politics, it's a function of our activism, it's a function of making sure that the ideals and the ideas that we want our constitutional system to represent is fully embodied within all parts of our society, so that no matter who the judge is, right, there will be no justice on the Supreme Court who will interpret the Equal Protection Clause now and say that it doesn't apply to women, right? That is outside of the bounds. That will never happen. Because gender equality, we may fight about other aspects of it, but gender equality is fundamentally a part of our culture, a part of our politics, not just, even though the constitutional language doesn't say anything about gender equality, but it's part of our constitutional interpretation. So the language matters, and we should fight about that, and we should fight to understand it, but the politics matter, the activism matters, all of those things are important as well.
Thank you, Guy. Just making quite clear what an art the act of drafting constitutional language is. I want to turn to a question from the audience, and for whomever is interested in answering this. Could there be a law that requires everyone to vote? So I think the answer is yes, there could be, but maybe then panelists, if you have reflections on the sort of wisdom of the concept of mandatory voting.
You know, a place like Australia has mandatory voting. It's a minimal fine. It does increase their participation. Of course, the thing that we worry about in the United States is whenever we make something a requirement, we worry what the impact will be on marginalized groups. So is this going to be used as a way of further burdening, further ostracizing, making things harder for marginalized groups? So will some people be fined and other people not? So we worry about that, but we have seen democracies require voting. And the question for us is whether that's consistent with our political culture and what impact will it have on the groups that we would worry about. And those are the types of questions that I would ask myself.
I think, Laura, if I could, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the previous comment about what Guy has laid out, which it struck me as really interesting about how the Constitution is interpreted and language, and that the Constitution today, as he said, would never be interpreted in a way that would not be inclusive of women. Well, that's where those of us who are directly affected and formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people who are part of this movement are talking about language in a way that people may not think is directly related to what the professor is referring to, but has every bit of importance to it. That's the language of how we're referred to. We think that that will eventually move into a space that will allow for the interpretation of the Constitution to automatically include us as well. That it would be absolutely be based on the power of the people to actually think that people, because of their status of entanglement in a criminal legal system, would be precluded from the right to vote. And that's the language struggle that we've had around the words of how we're described, that we see still in the media, and we see in conversations about us, and we see in the space around criminal justice reform still, those terms such as inmate and convict, and things that describe us in subhuman ways, and that also don't or aren't language that provides the space for evolution and for transformation. When you continue to refer to people in that way, there's no hope for change to come. And so we're working in that respect of getting people to understand how we need to be referred to. We're people. We're people. If you need to help people to understand that we've had an experience, one of the experiences, many in our lifetimes of being living in a prison, you add formerly incarcerated in front of people, or you add currently incarcerated in front of people, and we cease to use, as Eddie Ellis, our great leader prior to his demise, encouraged us to stop using these terms that devalue and dehumanize us on this road to the fight for full democracy, full humanity, and a recognition of that.
I'm thinking about when we start to do these things, Andrea, that you're bringing up, right? It's like a microcosm, right? For honoring people's humanity. And then we're not thinking in shortcuts, right? What is the one thing that I can put in this policy? We're actually thinking more holistically. What are the things that would truly get us to full democratic participation? And in some cases, if I know the full human being that is sitting beside me, really know that person or that community, and I'm putting the effort into building that relationship, the answer becomes far more than just putting a thing in a policy. It becomes, does this community have the child care that they need in order to actually get to the voting booth, or the transportation access, right? Or is it, I actually know that the cops circling the polling location are going to be a deterrent, regardless of whether automatic voter registration has become a thing, right? So it's like we're thinking more holistically because we know the full humanity of the people. And that to me is like, is so much more and requires relationship. And you're never going to get that from like a textbook or the internet. It requires hearing like the sorts of stories that Andrea has been sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really sort of driving home for me this theme that I've heard from everybody's remarks around the idea of who's in and who's out, and who our democracy is for, who gets to have a say, who belongs, and sort of just reflecting on your comments, Andrea, about the use of language and narrative to hammer home the idea that some people don't belong, which is not something that actually, when we stop and think about, I think a lot of us actually believe, but we've sort of bought into in a way because of exclusionary language, and because of that narrative work, and because, again, our Constitution at its ratification and still in many ways today is so does so narrowly define citizenship and belonging, and again, to this day, continues to carve out people who have been incarcerated or are currently incarcerated. So there's a couple, we have limited time left. Y'all have been so generous and gracious with your time and your expertise. I wanna, there's several questions that I wanna offer from the audience, and then I'll share a couple of them together, and y'all can speak to any of them that move you or not. If they don't, and then I want to close with just each of you having a chance to say a couple of closing words, reflections, anything that you would leave our audience with. So one of the questions that I think it'd be good for somebody to tackle if they want to, well, let me actually first note a comment from Betty that in Illinois, pretrial detainees, people who haven't been convicted but who are in jail, can vote. Are technically eligible to vote, and there are polling places actually in the Cook County jails, which is tremendous. And I'll add that that's true, in a lot of places across the country. Pretrial detainees have the right to vote, but are in practice kept from voting because they don't have access to a polling place. So that's an important part of the struggle too, is making sure there's access to the ballot for people who retain their legal right to vote. There's a question about who worked with Senator Warren and Senator Durbin on their amendment language. I'll speak for Judith, who's not here anymore, but I know that the Advancement Project was an integral part of drafting that language and facilitated a consultative process with many others. So those are two quick, short answers. Now, for panelists, if you want to tackle any of these, number one, given the mendacity of methods being deployed to suppress votes, to what extent should our counteractions be equally extreme? For instance, is it justified to encourage people from outside North Carolina to move temporarily into North Carolina to cast their votes there? So that's one question, a provocative one. That's from Zena. From Mary, why not include getting rid of the Electoral College? Its current provisions were made to advantage plantation planters. It has left us with 4 presidents who did not win the popular vote, all Republican. Such presidents take away proportionate power to large cities and also take away the legitimacy of a president. So that's number 2. And then number 3 from Jay, what are your sentiments on how we address the evolution and proliferation of democracy with regards to the general withdrawal from the current bipolar party system and decentralization of power from the 2 parties? So, no big deal, just a couple of big heavy hitters to close out the panel here. So just open it up to anybody who wants to reflect on any one of those questions before we close.
Just how we're gonna take over the world, huh, y'all? So I can take this North Carolina one. So I think we're in a moment where it's really clear, right? We need a diversity of tactics, and I think that we need to honor the ways that people are building movement. And I think it's really clear that we need tactics that are going to pressure the folks who have decision-making power in ways that we haven't done that before. That's the way that I think about it. In particular, in this particular example, around encouraging people to, so this particular example, I think if our analysis is that casting a ballot isn't the thing that is going to change the world, right? That movement building and organizing is the thing that's going to do that, then I don't think that this is the play, right? Because we need to be in relationship with one another in order to do this work long term. And so that's the way I'm thinking about it. That if you're down to build in North Carolina, then hit me up. And if you're going to do that right now, then let's build for the long term. And that feels different than making a move just for November, because that doesn't feel like it's going to build sustainable power.
A couple answers. I think on the Electoral College, I think definitely that's an easy call. We should try to abolish the Electoral College. And so that way, if for president, all of us should have a right, right? So speaking of the right to vote, you actually don't have a right to vote for president. So if your state provides you with a right to vote for an elector, which all states do, but then it also means that only certain votes really do count. That is, there are some places that are viewed as battleground states, and that's where a lot of the fight happens. But it's also what the politics in Congress and in the executive branch pay attention to. So the battleground states get a lot more policy attention than the non-battleground states. So the Electoral College has many perverse effects, so we should definitely get rid of them. On the two-party system, I think that's so much harder because so much of our politics are directed toward the two-party system in terms of how we do districting, right? So trying to establish parties at the local level are hard when they can't be national parties. But maybe there could be more variation at the local level. Maybe we could have even more nonpartisan groups at the local level and try to focus on the policies that we really want at the local level. And then the last part on the first question, but took that last. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a constitutional lawyer, I'm a voting rights lawyer. So I always think within those contexts, and I think it's trying to articulate and fight for the ideals and the rules that we want. I'm not a huge fan of a tit for tat approach, because ultimately what that means is that one side tries the tactic, the other side, and pretty soon we're all down in the mud. I'd prefer to think about what is the vision of democratic politics that we want, to elevate everybody and to work for that particular vision.
I think the one question that I feel compelled to respond to is about the two-party system. I think for Black folks in particular, I mean, as an African-American woman living in the most incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and organizing with other women, not just Black women, but women also living in similar communities around the country, one of the things that we're striving for is for our communities to thrive. So when you look at that from the perspective and you answer that question from the perspective of, say, Black people in this country that are a minority in number, that don't hold the electoral power, don't hold the economic power, don't hold the power of land, of owning land, all of these resources and things that have been carved out and dispensed and dispersed long before Black people in this country had the rights to do anything other than provide labor, free labor. We are aware of that and understanding that the goal for us is to build political and economic power in our hyperlocal communities, and that's the power of the people. That has very little to do with the two-party system. That has everything to do with the power of the people and how we build that power so that at least as a people that live in this country, we can have in our hyperlocal neighborhoods, thriving communities, safe communities, communities where there's individual and community accountability. That's what we're striving for at this point in our organizing right now.
Thank you, Andrea, for starting and also closing us with that call to action around organizing and power building. And I've heard that from you too, Ivana and Guy. I'm wondering if we have just a couple of minutes left. I wonder if y'all want to offer any final closing thoughts or remarks to the audience while you think about that question. I'll answer two more from the chat quite quickly. Does Demos plan to create a forum to facilitate strategic discussion among advocates? We're still thinking about what our next steps are on the proposal that we put out. So stay tuned. We'll put something out, on our list, or you'll hear about it if we do something like that. And then a question from Alan: most Western democracies automatically register voters upon reaching age 18. Can Congress pass such legislation? Yes, Congress can. Many states have passed what's called automatic voter registration. And there's a proposal in Congress called HR 1, the For the People Act, which would implement automatic voter registration nationally as well. So if you're really interested in that, Alan and others, call your members of Congress and tell them to make HR 1 their first priority during the next Congress. So with that, I'd love to have you all offer final thoughts and reflections to this audience who has been tremendous and stuck with us for the last hour and a half. And y'all have been incredible as panelists too. So why don't we start with Ivana, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the thing that's come up for me during this conversation is that, if we snapped our fingers tomorrow and we passed this thing and the world was beautiful and there was no coronavirus, there'd likely still be white supremacy and capitalism that puts people over profit in this world. And so we gotta build independent organizations that have the power to practice democracy every day, and that center anti-racism, that center the dismantling of patriarchy and all the other intersecting systems of oppression, because we can't stop at perfecting the structures. It's a muscle that we got to practice every day, and the people within it have to have that core value. So we got to build that. We got to build that people power army that's able to work within those systems once we've built it up.
You have parting thoughts to share with us, Andrea?
Let me see. Find an abolitionist organization in your area. Think about, learn what their platform is, and vote. Just vote.
Beautiful. Thank you. Guy?
Well, as an academic, I'm going to say support the work of the activists. I think these are the folks who are making a difference in our democracy. They're the ones who are going to change how we fundamentally do things and how we devolve power from those who have used it for their benefit to using it for the people who actually need it. So find the activists and support their work.
And you have two really fabulous examples of that right here in the Ivana and Blueprint, and Andrea and the National Council, and of course Judith, who left us earlier. I'm left with one comment that I think you made, Guy, but losing track now. But somebody said that we have to do the work of speaking our ideas and our ideas and our ideals that represent our values, and that's kind of what we need to lead with. And so I appreciate that each of y'all have done that on this conversation. And I think that's a call to action to all of us as we think about the change we need to see and how we can go about making it. So thank you all, audience members. Thank you, distinguished and badass panelists, and more soon. Take care, everybody.